we used to actually get people asking us all the time in Japan, like, you're a missionary, like, what is that? Like, what does that mean? Why are you a missionary, right?
One criticism or thing you'll hear is that missions, the word missions, doesn't really show up precisely as missions in Scripture. So, yeah, we talk about being a missionary all the time. So, what are we talking about?
That word is a Latin word. But if you look at the New Testament, you've got the missionary team. That's very prominent. In fact, if you really look at the New Testament after the Gospels, it's dominated by missionary authors, by missionaries writing to other missionaries. And whereas I think we tend to think of it as a book, by pastors, it's really a book that's mission-oriented, and it's about missionaries more than anything else.
And I think you're right. From history, from Scripture, we've traditionally thought of missionaries as the ones who go somewhere, from their home to somewhere else. And I think there's very much that's place still in the modern world. But what missions looks like, it looks very different now. There are many people who are saying there are UPGs in our backyard, there are unreached people, within our communities. And so I think the means of doing missions is changing, but the core of it is go. Reach the people amongst whom the gospel has not yet been established, and where there maybe isn't a thriving church. And so a lot of that drives many of our works and our teams and our organizations.
So is that idea of going? Would you say that the difference what's the difference between somebody who goes to church and is a Christian and a missionary, or is that a helpful distinction to make?
Well, I guess, because in the sense that ultimately a missionary's purpose is just to spread the love of Jesus, right? To share what the Lord has done for us, to be able to share that message with people who haven't heard it before, right? And so, like we mentioned, traditionally that kind of brings about the image that they're doing it in a context or amongst the people that they probably are very different from, right? They don't come from the same country, maybe they don't speak the same language. And so, but if you think about it more generally, just, being out there and sharing the love of God with whoever doesn't know it, then, I think there's certainly this kind of idea that really anyone and everyone is a missionary if you are a child of God. So, we used to actually get people asking us all the time in Japan, like, you're a missionary, like, what is that? Like, what does that mean? Why are you a missionary, right? So that was one of the things that I really appreciated about the opportunities we had in Hiroshima, just because people were so curious about what it was. And it was just easy to be like, well, I really love Jesus, and I really want other people to hear about him. And I know that here in Japan, there's not a lot of opportunity to hear about Jesus, to learn about him or the God of the Bible. And so that's what a missionary is. We just come here and, we try to take whatever opportunity we can to share about him, but also just love on people with the love of the Lord. So, I think it can mean so many different things, right?
But I won't lie, it does make me kind of mad when people are like, oh, we're all missionaries. Because, it's a lot to do to, give up everything, sell your home, I remember selling, all the possessions that I had just gotten at my wedding, and leaving with, I had 10 bags.
Yeah.
And so, there is the side that there is something unique about a vocational missionary. There's Christ's call to all in the Great Commission. While you are going, make disciples of all nations that everyone is required to do. But there's also the vocation, which you see in, the laying on of hands, right, with Paul and Barnabas. So I think that you're right. There's both strands. There's the call to everyone, but there's also the vocation of being a missionary that is different and set apart.
Yeah, and I think in our context today, I almost hate to bring this up because it muddies the water, but we live in the most mixed world ever. There's never been more ethnic mixing. So when we talk about that word go...
Well, can you explain what you mean by that a little bit more?
Right here in the city that we're in now, there's many, many different unreached people groups that are living, within just miles of us. And that's true now globally. And so you do have the opportunity. So that word go, there is a physical going sense to it, but it's also going into a context in which, it's not your natural context. It's not your culture. You're crossing a culture. And so, that's a part. Now, it doesn't diminish the need to go, because if you look at where the unreached are, that's going to require somebody to go. And even though this probably isn't, a popular thing to say, you're not going to really impact the unreached simply by doing diaspora work. The numbers just don't work out. Now, some of those diaspora people may, in a generation or two, accomplish the Great Commission by returning and ministering back in their home cultures. But there still is this huge number of unreached people groups. So even though we can do local missions and go cross-cultural, there's still a need to go as well.
Yeah. So, and to clarify the diaspora idea, just being those from other unreached countries coming to America, or maybe other places all over the world where there is a Christian witness, which is awesome. But fundamentally you're saying we still need people to go to those places as well that aren't originally from those countries.
Sure. Yeah, and I don't think, even with all of the moving that's happening now, that is part of the solution. But the Great Commission is so huge. I would just say that is it's an aspect, a facet, but it's not the final solution for what needs to happen.
I think raising the word unreached again with the word missions is something that also brings clarity where the need is. There's such an imbalance in how the global church uses resources. Just a fraction of the people and a fraction of the resources are being allocated to not just Christian causes, but within that, reaching the unreached. And so I think part of it is just saying, let's also address the imbalance there. Let's also allocate resources to bringing the gospel to where it doesn't exist. Of course, it's wonderful to continue to do ministry in our own communities, but there are places where the gospel hasn't been established.
When you're talking about resources, are you primarily talking about financial and monetary resources, or
and people? Quite often the statistic that's thrown around is 1 in 20,000, Christian workers will be focused on the unreached. Where we were in South Asia, working amongst the people group that we were reaching, the ratio of church planters reaching those people to the people was 1 to 1 million. And my wife and I would always joke, which million do you want? It was just a crazy joke, because it was just so overwhelming. But since Jesus was here, the harvest has always been plentiful and the workers have been few, but more so amongst the unreached at the moment.
Yeah, good.
Cool. Well,
Did we spike it?
we actually asked
Spike one, all right.
somehow we managed to answer that question. What is a missionary? So I did want to just talk a little bit about on-the-field experiences that maybe some of you have had. So I'm curious if there's an experience that you wish, when you were on the field, that some of your supporters who maybe hadn't gotten a chance to travel to your host country could have experienced.
There's one story that comes to mind when we were on a very remote island in Southeast Asia, and it's probably only like 1 mile across, and most of the people live on top of the water in their homes that are built on stilts. And I was wandering around, just talking to people, like telling them stories, meeting people. And I started telling this woman a story about this fisherman named Jesus and blah, blah, blah. And she goes, Jesus, is he that guy that lives on that island over there? And I was like, no. And that's where it comes to the unreached people. That captured my heart for just how far away the people were from understanding what it was that this jewel and gem of the gospel that I wanted to bring. And I think that's one thing, is just really wanting people to understand that sense of what it means to be unreached, and how far away that conception of who Jesus Christ is.
Yeah, it's always funny, the questions that you get from people when you do Bible studies with, whoever it is in an unreached people group. They really just have zero concept. Like, I had one person ask me why they'd never seen, like, a photograph of Jesus before. And they were like, he's so famous. How come there are no pictures of him? I'm like, I don't think they had invented cameras yet 2,000 years ago. So, yeah, it kind of, like, blew my mind a little bit. I was like, wow, like, that's where we're starting, just really, but it's like cool because they also don't have any preconceived notions of Christianity. So
where I worked, I'd say there were a lot of preconceived notions, but they were the wrong notions. For example, an insightful young man, I was working with predominantly, Muslim population, asked me one day, why do Christians wear a torture device around their neck? And, it's a really great question, because the cross is a torture device. He just said, it's just so odd that you'd celebrate that. Of all the things you could celebrate about your faith, that's the one you choose to celebrate. You know, it's eye-opening to see it through a very different perspective. So
one of the things that really opened my eyes to the need of humanity to the message of Jesus is when we're traveling through this country that we would eventually serve in, and we were watching the people go through their rituals which would earn them merit, for their salvation. And I was fascinated. They were going through a bathing type ritual, and I was thinking, these people are not like our Westerners who are not interested in spirituality, who think, oh, you're a Bible basher, don't talk to me about Christianity. They are actively seeking God. They just don't know the one true God. And I was talking to the church planter. He says, yes, this whole nation is a people who are earnestly seeking God. They've just never heard of the true God and the message of the true God. And it just struck me that these people have a greater desire for God than even the people in our own nation. And yet nobody has brought the message to them. And it really broke my heart. You know,
Mark, the first time, so I worked in a Muslim and a European context. The first time I was in Southeast Asia and saw what I would call like abject idol worship, even though I'd been a missionary already, it was still shocking to me. In the context I work in, you'd see some sacrifices of animals and things like that, but even that has a parallel, in the Old Testament. But when you go to a place where people are bowing before statues and revering them for the first time, that's a shocker. So,
but is there something about that that's also admirable? Like there's a level of faith in that, that they're exercising in bowing down to a statue. I don't know. It's harder for me to believe in that.
But they know that,
yeah.
Like you speak to these very people and you say, tell us your definition of salvation. Tell us your path to salvation. And time again, I would say, based on your definition of salvation and your path to salvation, do you think you're going to get there? I've never had one person say to me, yes, I think I'm going to get there. They know that we fall short of the glory of God intuitively, and we need a savior. And that's where we go through the rituals, but everybody knows that we're falling short. It's incredible.
Yeah, I think one thing also that really I wished that my supporters or friends back home could experience was amongst those people who were Christians and were believers in our context and in Japan. I think I've never seen people who are so committed to prayer, especially for the prayers for their families and their friends and their neighbors, like Japanese people were. During my 7 years there, we would have these prayer meetings, and every now and again I would get paired up with this one older lady. And every single time, the entire 7 years I was there, she would ask for prayers for her one cousin who was not a believer in the Tokyo area, right? And just so consistent and so faithful. And I thought, wow, like I could learn so much from the ways that these people are so committed to prayer. So I thought that was really cool.
There's so many things like that. I mean, in our context, Muslims are they're pictured in a certain way. When you live and work in a place like I worked in, you really come to love those people, and it gets you way past. I mean, you begin to see your own prejudices as you have these interfaces, and they become your best and dearest friends. And so, I also got to mention the food. The food many times is just incredible. But I would just say you're right on. You see things in those cultures that really teach you about the nature of God, the nature of people, and it's a real positive. Yeah.
What was one of the most memorable meals you had in your?
So I've been asked that question before. The most memorable meal I've ever had was actually peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. But the reason why it was memorable is we moved over into the Balkan region and couldn't actually move to where we were going to eventually settle, which was in Sarajevo, because of the war that was happening there. And eventually the time came, the Dayton Peace Accords was signed, we could move in. And so our family had all packed up. We were on the drive down, literally among the NATO and UN vehicles on the road, and we stopped halfway down and we had a simple peanut butter and jelly sandwich meal. It was memorable because we were finally doing what we had prayed about for so long. So it wasn't the food, but it was the meal.
Sure.
That was memorable.
Yeah.
But I've had a few others that are memorable, not always for the reasons you'd want them to be memorable over, but yeah.
That's one of the perks of the job, I suppose.
It really is.
Yeah. I was like,
yeah, go ahead.
I
No.
was like 5 months pregnant with my second child, and we were laying on the floor, these wooden floors on mats to sleep at night on this one island where we were doing some surveys. And, they were completely serving us all of the food that they normally
All
eat.
the best
and it
food,
was like,
yeah.
woo, a lot, for me as a pregnant woman. And so you'd get like raw, sushi that not sushi, raw squid. They would just pull it out and they'd put it quick on the pan and then serve it to you. It was really nice for them and not for me. But I'm from Kentucky. And so I was so excited on like the 5th day. They made fried chicken.
Oh.
And they heard, like the lady who was hosting me heard that I liked it. And every house I stayed at for the next week, they made me only fried chicken. I was so happy.
Culture of
So
hospitality.
that was my favorite memory of food because I felt like they were really serving me. And they called me Mama Suka, which was the brand name of the chicken.
Oh, wow.
And Mama means Mama likes because I was pregnant. So it was so fun.
Wow. Well, that actually is a good transition to another question, which is, tell us about like a significant or really like a truly meaningful encounter you had with a local. And I think maybe with a local in your host country, but I think maybe the distinction here is it can be whatever you want. But I don't think it's just tell me about a time when you were able to talk about God or share the gospel. I mean, I would love to hear that as well, but what does it look like to really relate to somebody who comes from a completely different culture from you?
So a couple of things come to mind, but one thing that always is kind of like a big, I guess it's sort of like a highlight / like, oh, I think I'm like really living here now was when I first moved to Japan, I would always be a part of all the pastors' meetings, even when I didn't speak Japanese. And so it was really important, just like the participation aspect of it, just that I would be present, regardless of whether I'm actually like contributing, right? And so then after I kind of started to learn the language a little bit, they would often ask me like, oh, Jessica, here's this issue or thing that we're thinking about. Like, what do you think, right? And so like a good American, right, I would like tell them my opinion and give them my idea, and they'd be like, oh, that's nice, but that won't work because of, this and this and this and this. And so after this had happened several times, I eventually realized like they're not actually really wanting my opinion. They're just asking because they're nice guys, right? Because these are like our pastors and they're like really like wonderful men, right? And so I was like, okay, like they want me to participate, so I will, but they're not going to take my ideas and whatever, that's fine, right? And then like about 5 years in, one day they asked me something and they're like, and so, I give them my answer and they're like, yeah, Jessica, that's great. We should go with that, right? And then it was just like from that moment on, like every idea or suggestion or whatever, they'd be like, yeah, that's good. We should do that. Please take care of it, right? And so it was just like this moment that I remember I was like, what happened?
Yeah.
Like I didn't like do anything. Nothing like actually changed.
You still don't know.
I still have no idea. I don't know if like 5 years was the magic number or what, but it was just like one day it's just like a switch turned on and all of a sudden they had just decided like we're going to trust Jessica and her suggestions and we're just going to go with it.
Potentially a really cool story or testimony to just the ministry of presence over a long period of time.
Where I really wasn't doing anything in those meetings.
Yeah.
So yeah. So yeah, that was a really kind of significant moment, I think, in ministry for me.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I'll add on to just what you said there, Jessica. I think time does count for a lot. We go there as missionaries and we go, we're looking for our local partners. We would love to do ministry, those who want to work to us. And we began to realize after a few years, they're looking at us as well, saying, are you the sort of people we want to partner with? And they've seen people come and go. Those who said, we're going to stay for long term, but they stay for a year or two and they go, and they're wondering, can you hack it here? Are you going to be the ones who are faithful? Are you the ones who are going to relate to us at a deep level? And you're right, it's not a magic switch, but there is a thing where trust begins at zero, and after a while, the trust is building as you interact with them, as you eat the food, as you love them. And that's when that's why we always say our most effective years in the field are not years 1, 2, and 3. They're quite often 4, 5, 6, 7, because that's when there's real trust. That's when they actually begin to tell you the truth about what they think about missionaries who are there, and they start to question you and push back. And I think that's when really honest partnerships begin to form, and the most effective ones. And I think it's not a magical time, but I think time helps to build that trust.
Yeah. I always wanted to go back and be like, did y'all notice when like all of a sudden you started like taking my ideas? Like, are you like conscious? Was that like a decision that was held like when I wasn't there? Or like, I always kind of wanted to know a little bit more of what they were thinking in the background.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think like Mark said, definitely there's that trust building and yeah, just it worked out.
Well, here's one more just kind of final question of life on the field would be, what is something you felt like was essential that you had to make sure you carved out time for maybe your own personal spiritual health and growth?
Other than the obvious.
Well, I mean, I don't know what the obvious is. So what is the obvious? And then maybe the not so obvious would be interesting too.
I'm really passionate about this because this is actually part of my role on the Orlando team. So we've developed a new part of our launch process for all of our missionaries that are leaving. And they go through this, it's kind of like a rule of life if you're familiar with spiritual formation. We call it the development plan. And so they look at all aspects of their life. So emotional, spiritual, physical, health. And how can you bolster these different 5 aspects of your health? And so we have them go through different questions with their team leaders and with their member development consultants. And that's based off really honestly my own experience of having to be really thoughtful. And it doesn't just happen to you. You have to carve out those times and really think through with the Lord, what are my priorities for my family? What is my job in this season and moment of life? And it might change. So for me, I had 5 or 6 years where I was 100% a homeschool mom. That was not necessarily my dream, but that was where I was. And so during that season, it looked a lot different than it does now. But I really feel that being intentional and thoughtful about every domain of your health is one of the most key aspects of resilience for our missionaries.
So what's like the most practical thing someone can do then to carve out that time? Just pick a time?
Well, I can talk as a mom. I think getting away is really important. I think it's really hard because, that means you actually have to step away. But I think getting back into that space with the Lord where it's you and him, your children might not always be with you. But you will always be with the Lord. And so getting that identity so firmly in Christ so that you can pour out is so important. So I do encourage, and when I was on the field, I went away for 3 days every semester at the very minimum. And usually I'd go with another person because it wasn't really safe for me to be traveling alone, but she and I would go and we'd have a very intentional time of filling up all of those things. So we would exercise every day, we'd do contemplative prayer, we would eat nice food, and it was just a really life-giving thing for me. But I think it depends on your season and your ministry and your role and how that needs to look with the different responsibilities that you have on your plate.
Do you think it's fair to say that carving out time for that is almost especially or particularly important when you're working in a context that is spiritually dark or lacks, a church community or things?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for saying that.
Well, yeah.
We call it radical self-care. So, and we even do it now. So if we get into a time of intensity in our family life, we say we're going into radical self-care mode. So we just kind of amp it up a little bit more. And just realizing that, I think, is how we kind of ride those waves with the Lord in times of suffering and trial. And we need to be filled up so that we can endure during those times.
I think as missionaries, we are passionate about what we do. And it's almost like this is the dream job. Finally, God is getting us to the field. And you come into a place sometimes where it's just boundaryless living. Your home is your ministry place. It's the homeschool. It's the kids. And it's easy to do ministry. Everything becomes ministry, and it can go for all day. And so that's where sometimes through hard lessons, you begin to realize, I need to get a bit of balance here. I need to care for self. I need to be a little bit selfish. Sometimes there are cultures where your home is a free flow of people, and it's expected, that you'll have your open door all the time. So families have to wrestle how to maintain healthy marriages, healthy family, while showing honor to the community and showing friendship to the community. But that's where marriages have to be strong before they get to the field, because the little cracks become big cracks under the stress of such situations. missions. And this is where serve in the local church before you go to build your ministry strength and your character, your ability to work in teams. Don't go to the field unless you've been tried and tested to some degree. Start cutting your teeth locally, serve in your local church. And I think that's one of the best places to test whether it's time to also go expand your horizons overseas.
When she started out, she said, "Do you mean beside the basics?" But those basics really are basic, and they're worth mentioning. That when you recruit missionaries and mobilize, what you find is that some people think that life will be better on the field in terms of their daily devotional life, and that's not necessarily true. I'd say it's actually harder and more challenging because of the busyness. And I think too, especially if you're teaching or you're in Bible studies consistently, you're thinking, well, I'm getting spiritually fed there, but you're really not. And so I would just say that basic idea is basic, and it's got to be mentioned.
Yeah.
The perfunctory mention, but it's important.
Though sometimes I found that it was easier to be motivated to like really carve out that time on the field because I was like so desperate for like the presence of the Holy Spirit in like any and every little thing, right? Here I'm like, going to the grocery store is not that hard, but in Japan I'd be like, oh my goodness, I pray, Jesus, please help me find the right milk, right? Like, so I think in that sense, sometimes it was almost easier on the field to like really be like, no, I need this time. Nothing's getting in the way, right?
I do miss those little miracles on the field. Because it's true, you get so desperate. And I was really feeling the Lord challenging me in my prayer life to believe big things. And I was sitting in this little mall and I was like, we will have a Starbucks in that place, that little shop. And my friend was laughing at me because I was kind of making fun of myself as though I was really going to pray for that. And do you know, 6 months later, a Starbucks opened there? It wasn't even available in Indonesia at the point that I said that. Awesome. So I do, I agree with you. I think you see God in such a powerful way, and he really shows up in these little, like the yogurt, the milk,
Right.
Those kinds of things.
Yeah, I was just kind of, what is going to be one of my follow-up questions, but like, were there any little, just sort of sweet things that you looked forward to as like a go-to activity or treat that would just recharge you, even if it wasn't, what was it? Self-care, something crazy self-care?
Yeah, radical self-care.
Oh, yeah. What was like the non-radical self-care?
For us, that's an easy answer to that. We lived about 3.5, 4 hours away from the Croatian coast. And so we escaped there 2 or 3 days at a shot, almost monthly. And it's just incredible. And so, that's the kind of thing you can do in a place that, here we have the coast, but I would have to say the Croatian coast is pretty gorgeous.
Sounds pretty nice.
It's the small things that feed your soul. Quite often, if you're having a good sleep at night, if you're eating well, you can actually, tolerate a lot of the culture shock that you're experiencing during the day. And so sometimes it's that little packet of chips that you go, oh, it's the chips that are not full of spice that I'm really enjoying all of a sudden, and they take off the market after 6 months because nobody's buying them except you. But these are the small graces that God sometimes gives you, and you don't rely upon those. These aren't the crutch that you lean on, but at the same time, you just say, when you get them, you say, thank you, Lord, for the small graces and that they nourish your soul.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's really cool.
Sometimes my supporters would ask oh, what can we send you, right? And this is not an ad, but I'd be like, just go to Trader Joe's and get your favorite snacks and send me those, and they were always awesome.
Yeah.
Always the best snacks.
Yeah, that's a good word on how we can. Those little touches go a long way for supporting missionaries. So, okay, life on the field is done. No, we can come back to it if we need to, but I want to switch a little bit bigger picture to some questions related to maybe like the sending side of things in regards to numbers and like tracking numbers in ministry and specifically in missions. So I wonder what your thoughts are on the benefit for churches and organizations for tracking things like baptisms, church plants, or professions of faith. Or is there a benefit to doing that, to tracking those sorts of milestones?
Don't you have a degree in missiology? I think you are a doctor in missiology, actually.
Way to throw him
So maybe we should ask you.
I think there's value in that. Sometimes numbers help communicate to those who are part of our ministry. You know, we live at the pointy end of something, and they live in a world which is all these other things. And sometimes we can communicate, you know, this is God's fruitfulness and blessing to the ministry. But at the same time, we don't also want to go to the point where they say those with the largest numbers are the ones who are being most effective and most fruitful. I've seen churches at the far extreme where they say, where are we going to give this money? And they say, well, if we give it to this place, we could see 1,000 converts with this money. Mm-hmm. But you don't want to give it to Japan. You might only get 2 converts with this money. Yeah. But we want to also allocate resources to the tough places. Mm-hmm. To where you have to be taking out the rocks. And so, to me, numbers are helpful if you apply them to yourself. It's actually better, rather than somebody saying you have to achieve these numbers of baptisms, converts, and things, to say what are we really trusting the Lord to do in this place? But even
from the standpoint of a field worker, if you're working in a specific country, you're saying personally you find...
Yeah, the best accountability is the ones where you feel, Lord, you know, what would you like us to trust you for? Mm-hmm. But even then, I must admit, we were not numbers driven. We were really saying, let's follow the relationships. Let's see what the Lord is doing in those. And how do we empower our local, churches, our local partners, so that actually they are the ones actually bearing the fruit more? Because one day we're going to go home, we're going to be gone from here. But if we can actually reproduce ourselves, cause them to be growing their capacity, that's actually going to show the longest fruit, even after the time that we're on the field.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really complicated question.
Precisely.
I mean, basically, I think what Mark is saying is, numbers count, but don't count on the counting. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you were to write a support letter, let's say you were Isaiah and you were writing a support letter, been at it my whole life, seen no fruit, please support me. Mm-hmm. Well, he got a whole book in the Bible. I think he did something important.
Yeah.
So, I think we got, even that word fruit, in the scriptures, if you look at the word fruit, it's mostly talking about personal spiritual transformation. Yeah. It's really not about counting, converts, baptisms. And there's organizations that do. I've seen, even just recently, for about $400 we can plant a church. And I would just say, so our organization collects a lot of missionary statistics. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that we do. And we like to make sure that there's large, obnoxious paragraphs in the front of a lot of studies that just say these numbers have problems with them. These are the limitations. And missionary numbers are very limited. And there's just so much stuff. I mean, you've heard people talk about, Henry Blackaby got famous for the concept of you need to join God where he's already working. Mm-hmm. Well, if you do that, you'd never reach the unreached, because he's not apparently working there. At least, you can't see it, and that's why they're unreached. And so there's a lot, I think, of simplistic kinds of jingoisms that we can pull out, but we're talking about people's lives, and it's complicated. Mm-hmm. And so I think we got to count. I think it helps us be accountable. It helps us understand what we're doing, but we should not be using that as an evaluation rubric.
So what would be a better one potentially? Because I think it does beg the question of, if someone spends 10 years or more in a place, and the largest number is the amount of years they spent on the field, in terms of fruit. Mm-hmm. How do you go about helping people understand that? Hopefully, this isn't universally, but that was a worthwhile investment of time in a life. 10 years is no small thing.
It's not, but when you're talking about spiritual transformation of cultures, we've got to get out of short-term thinking here. Mm-hmm. These things could be, generational. It could be 2 or 3 generations of people sacrificing before there are real breakthroughs. And, we don't like it, but the gospel is, at the center of the gospel is this concept of suffering. And suffering means you're not going to get instant results. There's going to be a price to pay. Sometimes that price is time. And so it could be that a missionary is not in a good, fit for what their gifting is. It could be that there are team issues there, and that's causing a problem. There are things worth thinking about in those situations, but our timelines are vastly different than God's timelines. And so faithfulness, that's an important thing. I'd say there's a lot of factors other than just the numbers that we could be looking at.
Yeah.
It's also seasons. Some of us are called to plant and sow. Some of us are called to reap. Now, who's the more faithful? Who's going to get the greater reward? I love the story. I was traveling to one part of the country I was serving in, and they had come to faith in large numbers. There was like 90% of this population come to faith. So I said, how did the gospel come here? They say, there was a missionary that came from Europe. He stayed here for about a dozen years. Nobody came to faith except the town drunk. And he went back broken because he thought I failed. The town drunk, many years later, brought some leaders, some people in the tribe to faith, and one of those was the leader of the tribe. And the gospel spread, and it exploded. Now, did that missionary feel my life was not fruitful? We don't know in the scope of eternity what our sowing is going to be doing. Even now, every conversation, we don't know where it's going to be taking us. And so we can't be focused on, Lord, am I effective? Am I successful? We have to say, Lord, help me to be faithful with what you've put into my hand. Yeah. And that's what we're called to do.
I have this kind of daydream that when we all get to heaven, there'll be this like part of heaven where God tells us how our lives affected all the other people that we didn't even know, right? We'll get to like meet them, we'll get to hear their stories. And so I like get really excited thinking about like, oh, like, you know, who will I get to meet that actually affected me and I wasn't even aware of it, right? But God's gonna like connect that string for me and vice versa, right? And so, yeah, I feel like, just like you said, I mean, that's the big picture we kind of have to hold when we're thinking about like, are we being fruitful? Are we having a effect, right? Is there a good rate of investment and rate of return? And yeah, I think absolutely.
Particularly in a place like you were in Japan.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only way you can keep going in Japan. So yeah, I just kind of dream. I'm like, you know, maybe I only like reached out to one or two people, but maybe like down the line, one of those will be like the next Billy Graham. And, you know, then if you think of it that way, then it's absolutely worth it. And I can't figure that out or determine it from where I am right now. So I just want to try and be faithful to what the Lord has called us to.
Go ahead.
I think we need to be aware of our American culture bias toward, you know, efficiency and getting things done and being successful and being fast. And so I love church history too. And I think what we can learn so much is from most of the missionaries that have lived outside of America, and even the early missionaries in America, who would pack all of their life belongings in a coffin, and a lot of them wouldn't even arrive, you know, on the field because they would die in transit on the boat. And so I think for me, it's more of a stepping back and saying, what's in my heart when I'm looking at my success and when I'm looking at this efficiency or numbers? I definitely agree. I think numbers are essential on one hand, but I think on the other hand, there's the kingdom paradox that the gospel is a mystery and that it goes forth when the seed goes into the ground and dies sometimes. So...
Well, it's a good thing you're not on the recruitment team. I just have to say that. I'm just kidding.
You see that dies.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And it does actually transition well, I think, into a slightly different type of topic, which is that I've heard it said that missionaries are kind of like the original influencers. And so to unpack that a little more, it's almost like, you know, going back for a long time, especially since, you know, this relationship where we have supporters and we raise money and we kind of pitch our visions and ministries for what it is that we feel like God is calling us to do overseas. And then you gather up a community of followers that kind of band around you. But then there's this pressure. There can be a pressure, I think, on missionaries to perform or to have results or to have something to say to those supporters.
Sure.
And I'm curious if you think that's a valid parallel, or how would you say it's different than someone who's like a social media influencer and has a bunch of followers online?
What's the actual question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So,
I feel like I'm too old for this question.
yeah. Oh no, you're not.
It's okay. It's okay.
social media.
For all the Gen Zs watching.
Good for you. I think it's this idea that actually, is this an idea? That missionaries sometimes feel a lot of pressure to convey what it is that they're doing with their time, the fact that they're often living on somebody else's money that has been gifted to them. And so their life is kind of under a microscope at some level. And you come home once every few years and people are really eager to hear what it is that you have to say. You might even send newsletters once a month with photos of your family and the things that you've been up to. There's a certain level of pressure. And so to take it one step further, I think a criticism of social media nowadays is that a lot of what you see from people online is maybe not precisely who they actually are if you were with them in person or if you were. So is that a dynamic that you faced or that you've seen people face, that there's a discrepancy between what it is that you're actually doing on the field and in life and what it is you feel like you need to portray to those that are following you back at home? Maybe this is something we can actually speak to the supporters and churches on behalf of our missionaries. Yeah.
Because there are some people who, when you get home, say, tell me the results, tell me the good news stories. Yes, I think there's a place for that. We our part of our role is not just to do the work, but to actually help mobilize the church, the next generation of missionaries, to be inspired and to come along. And I think so. I don't resent that role. I think we need to embrace that joyfully. But where there's supporters are evaluating us by these stories, is where maybe we can. Our job is also to say to the church, ask your missionaries not just about the results, but say, how can we pray for you? What are the most difficult things that are happening on the field to you? What are the ways that we can serve you while you're away, or how can we pray for your children? The most valuable people who are our closest friends who've walked with us in the 20 years that we've been missionaries are the ones who say, we're taking you out to dinner, but you don't even need to talk about ministry. We just want to have you have fun. We're going to feed you the food we know you like. And, we just want you to feel that you've got friends while you're here. And those are the sort of people who have been with us for 20 years. The ones who want to support a project, but we want to buy a goat for the community. We want to do something. They will come on board for a year or two, and then they will drop off when the next project comes along. And so for us missionaries, it's realizing, one, don't take ourselves too seriously. We've got to, but also build relationships based on the ones who actually care for us, and be transparent. Don't try to be James Hansen Taylor. Don't try to communicate a story that is beyond ourselves. That's maybe the analogy of social media that you're saying. Let's not try to portray something that is artificial. Let's be authentic. Let's help educate them about the challenge of being in a cross-cultural situation, and let's also say this year was a terrible year, and we really would love you to just get beside us and pray that the Lord will continue to keep the doors open. And so our job is to also educate and to bring our supporters along on the journey.
I also feel like a lot of times as missionaries, because a lot of us are being supported by people back home, if anything, I feel like more often that we put pressure on ourselves, be like, I am expected to show results. I am expected to give a good report and to prove to my supporters that their investment is a worthy one, even if the supporters don't actually feel that way, right? The supporters are probably just as happy to hear about, like, how did your kids do, and what is the Lord telling you in your life, and how is that one person that you've really developed a good relationship with. They're oftentimes really happy with those stories, but we feel like that's not good enough, and so then that's when this pressure to kind of come up with this like Instagrammable story comes out, right? And so I think that's definitely really unhealthy for missionaries, and I think also if we can take off that pressure and just be like, like Mark was saying, just be real, be authentic, and tell people what it's like, and tell people who you're, ministering to, and the difficulties and the ways that people can be praying for. And I think a lot of our supporters and partners back home really want to hear those things, actually, and really want to know, like, what is it really like on the ground? And so I think when we're able to be authentic, I think it's really valuable for people back at home.
I think it's probably a hard balance to strike between. I think the biggest challenge is often you're communicating with a large group of people and maybe not in a personal environment like this, where we're just sitting over a table and it's like you can bounce questions back and forth. And And then, another question that came in too is just this idea that there are maybe cultural complexities that are really hard, maybe nearly impossible to communicate, say in an email newsletter. Mm-hmm. So how do you thread the line between being transparent and also wise with what you communicate to those that maybe don't have a full of understanding? And thanks for, I think that pressure that missionaries feel, I think was kind of the heart of the question, was like, there's a performance concern. So, but back to how do we thread that line between transparency and
and especially because a lot of us also, we want to share about the cultures and share the struggles, but we also don't want to like criticize the cultures that we go into. It's really easy just to like start sounding like you're complaining or like, oh my goodness, this one aspect of Japan really blows, right? I mean, that's not what we want to do. So I think that's a really good question.
But I think a lot of this is where we as Americans are really vulnerable because we are such an individualistic culture. So we're just like, I have to figure this out by myself. And so one of the things we've tried to do over the past 15 years is to develop like a really vast network of mentors and people to guide us through these things. Like if I'm not certain, like this is a concern, because like I have high school age kids. I can't say their private things on an update letter, but there's some things that are obvious that, this isn't really appropriate for me to share with people. They might not want me to say this. But then there's other things that it's like, oh, it'd be really good to say that I have a concern, but I don't want to like give the specifics. So I will go to my mentor and I'll be like, you know what's going on. How can I word this in the right way? And she'll help me. So that's why member care is here. We walk alongside people for this kind of thing all the time. But also this is like a thing that I feel that I want to communicate is how important it is to be developing these people in your life even before you leave for the field. Because it's so hard when you're on the field and you're really remote and, it's the middle of the night in America and you don't have anybody to call, but you have a team leader on another island who can help you. So you're not alone to figure these things out. And I think there's a lot of people who've been there before us who can guide us.
And I think part of the answer that she's hinting at here too is you're going to have an inner circle that you're going to share very intimate things with. And then there's a broader circle. And, like a prayer letter or newsletter list could have hundreds of people on it. Obviously, that's a different type of communication. There's also, I think, a generational shift going on that we're experiencing. I mean, when I went out, I'm so old, we didn't have email. And a phone call home.
What?
Phone call home was like $25-$30 a minute.
Yeah.
Wow. And
it's actually shocking.
Okay, now it's real.
And so you're today, I mean, people are sharing things. I'm just thinking, why would anybody ever share that even to a small circle, and they're sharing it with the world. So I think there's a cultural shift going on here.
Yeah.
And the younger missionaries will figure that out, and they will adapt to what that shift is. So.
Yeah.
And part of it is also not getting bitter and twisted if you feel as if they're not getting it. They're not living in the context that you're living in. They're not understanding the day in the 48-degree heat when you feel like, shriveling.
He means Celsius.
Yeah, I was like, how do you have to
I didn't even think about it. I was like, that's the worst.
I'm freezing in 48 degrees.
And so there are friends who will try to empathize, but, sometimes I find missionaries, they get bitter and twisted when people don't want to listen to my stories. And when they don't get what I'm trying to say, that's okay. They don't expect them to expect. They don't live there.
I'm not gonna get it.
Yeah.
And so be moderate in your expectations, but invite them to visit and say, would you like to come and visit? And the ones who visit actually are the ones who, many of them are the ones who continue to say, wow, I love what you're doing. And so...
Or...
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, or they're saying, oh my gosh, you live like you're camping outside every day. That's what my brother-in-law says. He was like, you live like you're camping outside every day of your life.
Well, we had a team come over. Now, we lived in a blown out city. I mean, 1 million mortar rounds fell in Syria. But, we were living there, so we didn't see that. But we had a team come over, and they basically sat in our living room and cried every night about all the destruction they saw. But, for us, that was kind of like, wow. We're adapting because we're not even seeing it, so it was a good thing. Not for them, but
Oh man,
so true.
All right, I do have one final question that I'd love for each of you just to go around and briefly answer, and it's, what advice would you give someone who's in the midst of considering whether or not missions is what they should do? So, Coco, I don't know if you just want to go first.
Oh, wow. Well, I'll go back to some of the things I've shared before, as that when we were thinking about going overseas, we actually went to all of our mentors. We had like 10 pastors and people in ministry, and we were thinking we wanted to do something strategic to reach to people that didn't have as much access to the gospel. And my husband has always wanted to be a pastor, so we're like, we could either plant a church on the West Coast or go to the unreached people. And so we asked every single one of them what they thought, and every single one said to go overseas for vastly different reasons. And by the end, we came away with this whole plethora of things we had never thought about, like our kids were really young, so it would be much easier to go now, and how much more unreached it was over there, and how many fewer people were willing to go there. And that really was a huge part of our discernment process, was something that was done in community with our church, with people who loved us and really knew our personalities. And for me and my style, that gave me a lot of confidence moving forward. And it also inadvertently helped us establish our support base and kind of got a galvanized layer there of a church and individuals to support us as we went.
If I had a dollar for every time somebody said to me, "Oh, we could never do what you do," my kids' education fund would be much higher than it is now. I think the perception is missionaries take superhuman people and we could never do it. I just want to say to folks, we all feel very ordinary. If you speak to every missionary, we feel like very ordinary people. We put our pants on one leg at a time and we get out of bed the same way. But the God uses the most unexpected people, and God uses broken people. He uses ex-engineers, ex-architects, ex-school teachers. There's a place for almost everybody on the mission field, and we need all sorts of different shapes. And so some people might be saying, maybe God's stirring my heart, but I don't think I fit. I just want to say, maybe you might just be the one that plugs a hole. I'm just an administrator. All I'm good at is shuffling paper. We are desperate for administrators on the mission field. And so there's...
Recruiting plug.
Yes, there's a place for almost everybody, and if the Lord is stirring, our call is to be obedient, not to work it out. Just to say, Lord, what would you have me do?
That reminds me, I remember I met this one girl, and a few months later, she told me she was going to become a missionary to Japan, and I was like, oh, what led that? And she was like, well, after I met you, I thought if you could become a missionary, anybody could do it. I was like, thanks.
Take it as a compliment. Yeah.
It's like, I'm going to take that as a compliment, yeah. But yeah, so totally, I feel like that's so true. We're so ordinary and normal and broken just as much as anybody else. But I think one advice I would have, I think for me, I really had no idea what I was getting into. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I didn't know how long I was going to be there. I didn't know what I could do. I wasn't even sure of what my own gifts were in terms of ministry. And I just had so many questions, but I knew I wanted to go overseas, and I knew I wanted to go to Japan. And so I feel like the Lord was really gracious in helping me just be just start with that and just take the first step and see where it leads you, right? If God really doesn't want you to go, don't worry, you won't get there, right? And so just even if you don't have the whole picture figured out, just taking those first steps, whether that's talking to some friends or reaching out to an organization like Pioneers and, talking to our mission mentors, right? I think just taking that first step is really important.
Well, if someone's thinking about it, I try to sell them up on it, because it's been, at least it's not everybody's story, but in our case, I just can't imagine not having had the opportunity. And it's not been easy. There's been heartache. There's been heartache in our family. There's been heartache in what we saw among people we worked with. It's not easy, but you talk about fulfilling. It's incredibly fulfilling. And it's not even the accomplishment, like we talked about the numbers earlier. It's not that we did something that was so crazy and left behind this huge movement and all of that kind of thing, but it really is just the risk-taking, the ability to make relationships with people that you otherwise would never have an opportunity to be with. I'm telling you, being on a team with other missionaries is incredible. They're high-quality people. There's so many pluses to it. It's not all rosy. I'm not saying it's all rosy, but for me, it's just been such a great blessing. I just say, jump in. and give it a shot and see where the Lord will lead you.
Awesome. Well, I do really thank all of you for coming and joining with us for this discussion. I think it was really fun and beneficial. And so, yeah, I appreciate it. And for you who are watching, we do want to say if you enjoyed a discussion like this, we'd love for you to like and subscribe this video. And thanks so much for watching.